All righty. Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the Bhagavad-gita virtual Satsang. My name is Hari-kirtana, and it's a great pleasure, as always, to spend this time with you, and I'm very honored that you have chosen to spend this time with me. Last week, it's always so tempting to say tonight after that, due to my font, I guess. But I'll resist the temptation. Last week, our introduction to Karma Yoga, we are still in the second chapter. We covered verses 39 through 46. We spoke about the relationship of knowledge and action, the importance of single-pointed focus on the end game, on the goal of action, the ultimate goal of action. And we spoke just a little bit about what the Vedas are, so that we have a little context, given that the Bhagavad-gita is a wisdom text arising from the Vedic tradition. And Krishna, in this section of the second chapter, is referencing the Vedas and Vedic culture. So a little bit of knowledge about the Vedas, what they are, and what the relationship of the Bhagavad-gita to the Vedas actually is. Tonight's program, we will continue our introduction to Karma Yoga. Actually, this whole front end from this point in chapter 2 well into the fourth and fifth chapter, technically all the way to the sixth chapter is considered Karma Yoga, but somewhere around there we will transition into the yoga of eightfold mysticism. But we'll be talking about Karma Yoga for a while. It by itself, a very deep subject. We'll speak tonight about the importance of action without attachment and what that means when we speak about action without attachment, at least what the Bhagavad-gita is trying to tell us that it means. We'll also talk about what it means to be liberated. And we're covering verses, like I said, 47 through 53 this evening. We'll also do a little bit of comparative translation work. I'm going to give you the translations for the verses that I have rendered, and then we're going to look at another translation to this set of verses and do a little comparison. There are things that I like about these verses, and there's also some interpretive translation going on that I want to point out to you, so that when you read any edition of the Bhagavad-gita, one you have or anyone you pick up in the future, that you'll be able to recognize when a translation is interpretive as opposed to self-evident or transparent, I should say, in its translation. All right. So here we go. Chapter 2, verse 47. You are entitled to take action, but you are not entitled to the fruits of your acts. You should never let results be your motivation for action, nor should you adhere to inaction. Verse 248, bring your mind and senses under control and act without attachment to success or failure. Such equanimity is called yoga. 49, O conqueror of wealth, Arjuna, take shelter of discernment and, in that state of consciousness, distance yourself from lesser actions. Those who seek only the fruits of their actions are misers. 50. One who is linked to reason sheds both good and bad reactions to their actions even in this life. Therefore, absorb yourself in yoga, for yoga is virtuosity in action. 51. The great sages endowed with wisdom free themselves from reactions to their actions by renouncing the fruits of their activities. Thus liberated from the obligation of future births, they attain a state that's beyond the reach of material miseries. 52. When your intelligence has passed through the dense forest of illusion, you will find yourself indifferent to all that has been heard and all that is to be heard. 53. We'll wait for 53. We'll save that for the end. It'll be a big surprise. All right. So now I'm going to go back and we'll look at each verse individually, and I'll speak a little bit about each verse. So in our first verse of the evening, 47, the verse was, "You are entitled to take action, but you are not entitled to the fruits of your acts." Okay, well, a reasonable question, I think, is why are we not entitled to the fruits of our actions? If you have any thoughts as to why we would be entitled to act but not entitled to the fruits of our actions, go ahead and type your comment into the Q&A box. We'll bat this idea around a little bit. Meanwhile, the second half of the verse says, "You should never let results be your motivation for action, nor should you adhere or be attached to inaction." So here's something about the nature of the moral philosophy of the Bhagavad-gita. The Bhagavad-gita proposes a deontological versus, I guess I should show this to my proofreader, versus consequentialist philosophy. So what this means is that a deontological moral philosophy says that you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because you'll get a particular result. Where a consequentialist philosophy says that you do the thing that's going to get you the best result, and you judge the value of an act based on the possible outcome, or at least the desired outcome, the expected outcome. So here's Krishna is clearly saying that one should be attached to the process, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, and not be motivated by what you expect to get out of it. I find myself saying in my yoga classes all the time, especially when we're doing headstand, just think about the process. Don't worry about the result. Don't think that you're not doing headstand unless your feet are all the way up in the air as high as the length of your body. Engaging with the process is doing the pose. So that's one way that this actually applies for those of us who are doing yoga on a yoga mat, the physical practice of yoga. But more to the point, in our lives, when we make the results of our action the goal of our action, then that takes us into the mode of passion of the three qualities of material nature: goodness, passion, and ignorance. And by fixating on the goal, our intelligence becomes distorted. This is one reason why in yoga we remain focused on the process, because it's the process that's purifying. So now let's get back to why are we not entitled to the fruits of action. So Nila Madhava, offers us, well, if I earn a paycheck, for example, I'm entitled to that money, right? Well, that's conventional wisdom. You know, I put in the work, I deserve the reward. And I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Sue, we should do something because it's the right thing to do, but cannot control what happens as a result of what we do because there may be many other factors. I think that has some merit. We would like to be in control of the result. The fact of the matter is that there are so many things that are out of our control, irrespective of what we do, that one can reasonably state that the results are beyond our control. But does that explain why we're not entitled to those results, whether we control them or not? So I think the question may still be out there. Bonnie, I think of this quote often. The good you do today will be forgotten tomorrow. Do it anyway. Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. I sometimes think about it from the standpoint of 100 years from now, who's going to know? Well, the person who will know is Krishna. We discussed earlier how one of the manifestations of the Supreme Person is the Param Atma, the Supreme Person within the heart. And that person accompanies us not just in this one lifetime, but in lifetime after lifetime, body after body, birth after birth, and always remembers what we do because he's omniscient. Therefore, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Well, this is Krishna speaking and advising Arjuna, as such, by extension, advising us. And therefore, if we want to do something in accordance with the instructions of the Supreme Person, then the Supreme Person will remember when we do that, when we take his advice. Shana, doing the right thing is our duty. So that is the default. Therefore, if we are not doing the right thing, then we are acting against our obligation and our true nature as good. This is a really nice insight and comment. The idea that it's our duty to act, and we have a duty to do the right thing, irrespective of the result. A nice example of this, or a clear example, I should say, is if one is in the military, then you may be obliged to do your duty and you will lose your life. You're making the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of doing your duty. Obviously, you're not doing it for the result insofar as the result for yourself. There may be attachment to a result insofar as you know that by making this sacrifice, others may be saved or some other higher good will be served. But still, there's the idea that it is our duty to act. So, Shana, I think you're onto something here. Good. All right. Thank you all very much for your contribution to the discussion on this point. What I've got here is that the appearance of a direct cause and effect relationship between our actions and our results is illusory. If we're karmically destined to get a certain result, then our actions may have no impact or vice versa. So in Neela Madhava's example, you work, you get paid. Well, if you're karmically destined to receive a certain amount of wealth, could very well be that you don't work and you still get paid. If you're karmically destined to be shortchanged or not to have wealth, then you could do the work and then get ripped off and not get paid. And you may think, I'm entitled to getting paid because I did the work. But some other work that you performed in the past may have created a destiny for you that you would be cheated or that you would not have the same level of prosperity that you expected based on the work that you've done. In either case, it is the Paramatma who's not only the witness, but the one who gives sanction to all actions and all reactions. So our free will is exercised in engaging in an action. But that does not determine the result. And because, as we go further, and as we discussed as well in the past, because the results of actions are intended to be offered in order to achieve the highest goal of life, then our thinking should be in terms of the results of my actions are intended not for me, but for someone else. And this is the first stage of karma yoga. Detachment from actions, detachment from the results of actions with the intention of offering the results of actions to the highest truth of the Supreme Being. All right, let's move on to the next verse. And if you have any other comments or questions about this, or any of the other verses that are coming up, just go ahead and type them in and I'll see them and get to them as quickly as I can. 248. Again, the verse, bring your mind and senses under control and act without attachment to success or failure. Such equanimity is called yoga. So here we have a definition of yoga as equanimity or stillness of mind. This corresponds with the definition of yoga given in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. But here's an important difference. Here, Krishna is speaking about stillness of the mind while acting. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are a handbook for meditators who have disengaged from the world. And this is an important distinction that makes the Bhagavad-gita particularly relevant for us. We usually do not go off to the forest or sit in a cave and meditate and leave the world behind. The vast majority of us are engaged with the world. And I was even speaking to someone today who had a kind of stereotypical idea that the mystics of yoga were all people who just said, later for you, world, I'm out of here, and just go sit still and meditate their lives away. And here, Krishna is very clearly pushing back against that stereotype of the yogi who disengages from the world. He's talking about the same effect, stillness of the mind, but stillness of the mind while acting. And that's pretty different. So samadhi in action is possible. 249, O conqueror of wealth. Kind of an interesting phrase, name for Arjuna. Take shelter of discernment, and in that state of consciousness, distance yourself from lesser actions. Those who seek only the fruits of their actions are misers. So in this verse, here, Krishna kind of slams people who are completely absorbed in acting for the sake of the results of their actions, calling them misers, which is kind of interesting because someone who's very passionately trying to accumulate wealth for themselves, even if they give some of their wealth away in charity for material welfare work, still, because it is constrained to the satisfaction of the mind and senses for both the giver and the one who's receiving a gift of charity, because it all happens in the material realm, Krishna regards this as miserly activity. Why? Because the real wealth is transcendental knowledge. So here we have this indication that rather than the pursuit of material wealth, attachment to the results of actions, spiritual wealth is what one should actually be aiming for with their actions, with whatever action they take. And again, it's attachment to the process, not attachment to the result. Verse 50. One who is linked to reason sheds both good and bad reactions to their actions, even in this life. Therefore, absorb yourself in yoga, for yoga is virtuosity in action. This is actually one of my favorite verses of the Bhagavad-gita, because Krishna describes yoga as the art of working. This is another translation that we often see, that this phrase, virtuosity in action, excellence in action, skill, great skill in action, real skill in action, or the art of work. I particularly like that. Why is this kind of action considered to be virtuosity in action, or the art of all work, or actual excellence in action? It's because this action does something that no other action can do. It destroys reactions to actions rather than generating reactions to actions. That's a pretty neat trick. It's like mystic judo. You can be engaged in the same activity, but because your intention has changed, there's been an inner transformation. The reason for your acting is different, and your attachment to the results of your actions has melted away. It looks like you're doing the same thing that you might otherwise have been doing. It looks like you're doing the same thing as somebody else might have been doing. But there's a qualitative difference to your action that might otherwise remain unseen. But it makes all the difference in the world, because the ultimate goal of action is to free yourself from reactions to your actions. This is what it means to be liberated. To be liberated means no longer obligated to experiencing the reactions to one's actions, which means no longer obligated to experience future births. It won't be until the 8th chapter of Bhagavad-gita when Arjuna circles back to this topic of karma and asks Krishna, please tell me, what is karma? He has a string of questions. Among them is, what is karma? And this demonstrates something of the elliptical structure of the Bhagavad-gita that I discussed earlier when we spoke about following the dialogue. And Krishna replies that karma is action that generates future births. So to be liberated means to be liberated from the obligation to take future births. And that is the art of all work. And this is the same thing I had before. Attachment to the process, not the result. This is what happens when you duplicate slides and copy and paste. Okay. Verse 51. The great sages, endowed with wisdom. Hold on. I'm going to back up because Shana's comment. My translation says, those who work selfishly for results are miserable. And that is in 250, I take it. Let me just see what I've got in this other edition. Or maybe it's one behind. Let's back up. $49, that's what you're looking at. Okay. Yes. So those who are motivated only by desire for the fruits of action are miserable. This is also a perfectly legitimate translation, indicating that a miser is miserable. Look at the similarity between the two words themselves. A miser is naturally miserable because a miser does not experience the joy of generosity and is always in anxiety about losing that which they are trying so hard to hold on to. The mode of passion, which is the mode that influences one to be miserly, results in misery. You get distortion of your intelligence along the way. Your spiritual progress stalls out due to the deformation of intelligence and the distortion of knowledge, the misapprehension of reality. And you end up in a state of constant anxiety, of wanting more and never being satisfied, and worrying about losing what you have. You can observe anyone who is materially well off and yet overly concerned with acquiring more because it's never enough, or losing what they have. And yes, you will see that they are miserable. Yeah, it is an interesting connection between the idea of being a miser and being miserable. Okay, moving forward. We were up to 51. The great sages, endowed with wisdom, free themselves from reactions to their actions by renouncing the fruits of their activities. Thus, liberated from the obligation of future births, they attain a state that's beyond the reach of material miseries. So here, wisdom is attained by following in the footsteps of the wise. You want to be a wise guy? Find a wise guy and then emulate their actions. Don't imitate them, but follow in their footsteps. Figure out how to apply the principles of wisdom that wise people have learned and have lived, because a wise person is someone whose example you can follow, not just someone you can listen to. Wisdom is attained by following in the footsteps of the wise. Here we have a little bit of interesting Sanskrit to take a look at. So the last two lines in the translation were, thus liberated from the obligation of future births, they, the wise, attain a state that's beyond the reach of material misery. So there's a couple of interesting things going on here. First, Janma bandha vinirmukta. So Janma means birth. Bandha means lock or a bind, a knot. Those of us who are practicing yoga on a yoga mat, or any of you who are yoga teachers, you are familiar with the bandhas, the locks. So Janma bandha, the obligation of future births. Vinir mukta, mukta as in mukti, liberation. They are liberated from this. And then in the second line, which is what I've got up on the screen here, padam gacchantyanam. So padam is sometimes translated as that state, but it also can be translated as abode or place, indicative of a place. So the Sanskrit word Vaikunta means the realm of freedom from anxiety, which means no time, no repeated birth and death, no obligation to experience the effects of time. So you can think of this two ways: a state of being or a place that you go to, which is to say, if you are no longer obliged to take birth in the material world, where do you go? You don't get a material body. You have no karmic obligation. You've burned off all of your old karma. You haven't generated any new karma. Where do you go? Well, you go to Vaikunta. You go to that place where a spirit soul may reside without a material body and without having to go through the difficulties associated with life in the material world. In other words, no miseries, no anxiety. Vaikunta means that place where there is no anxiety. Now, in order to wrap our heads around this, we have to make a distinction in terms of what does it mean to have a form. If you're born in the material world, then you get a body, you have a form, you look like something, you have a tangible shape. And oftentimes we hear that the opposite of form is formless. And that makes sense until you qualify the form as material form. When you qualify the idea as material form, then the opposite is spiritual form. Material world, the opposite is spiritual world. We assume that the world doesn't need to be qualified because it's the only thing within the realm of our experience. We don't have to qualify it as material world. When the material world exists in a context. If you want to understand the material world, then you have to understand the context of the material world, and that makes the assumption that the material world sits within something larger than itself. Just like if you want to understand the United States of America, you can't just study the United States of America. You have to study it within the context of the world in which it exists in order to have a complete understanding. So similarly, in order to have a complete understanding of the material world and how it works, yoga philosophy proposes that there's a context to the material world, that the material world resides within something larger than just itself, and that something larger is the spiritual world, which is referred to as Vaikunta. So there's something for you to think about, and if you have any questions about this concept of Vaikunta, of a spiritual world that provides a context for the material world, or any comments, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A area. But I just wanted to point out this interesting aspect of the Sanskrit, the word padam. So the question is, can you say again what Vaikunta is? Yes. Vaikunta means the spiritual world, or the world in which there is no anxiety. Freedom, the world that is free from all of the anxieties associated with the influence of time. Because when we assume our natural, our true nature is one of eternality, of eternal being. Therefore, Vaikuntha is that place where eternal beings reside in their true nature and are therefore beyond the influence of time, and time is the ultimate source of anxiety. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for asking. Okay. Next up, 252. When your intelligence has passed through the dense forest of illusion, you will find yourself indifferent to all that has been heard and all that is to be heard. So, heard and to be heard refers back once again to Vedic religiosity. Remember earlier in our last episode, Krishna was kind of down on the whole Vedic ritual thing. This is called the Karma Kanda section of the Vedas, where you receive instructions on how to perform ritualistic ceremonies that will bring about good karmic results, actions or sacrifices that place one in harmony with cosmic order in order to get a good material result. And Krishna was like, that's not really that big a deal. If you understand the ultimate purpose of the Vedas, then these exercises in material religiosity have all the value of a small well that's been dug right next to a great reservoir of water. It's just not that significant. So the word Shruti indicates the Vedas, or that which is heard. And that's what this is referring to here. That when you understand the true meaning of action, or as Krishna puts it, when your intelligence has passed through the dense forest of illusion, right, then this will seem insignificant. Now, it's important to consider or to understand that while Krishna is clearly not impressed with the Karma Kanda portion of the Vedas, or that is that portion of the Vedas that deals with Mary got your question. I'll get back to it. That portion that deals with how to enjoy material life, or try to enjoy material life. He's not putting down the Vedas themselves or Vedic culture. The ultimate goal of Vedic knowledge is transcendence, to understand Krishna himself and to understand that the material world is a losing proposition, and the ultimate goal is to free yourself from the influence of illusion and the obligation of repeated births and deaths in the material world. So that's where the Vedas ultimately take you. But just as in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, you can get caught up in meditation on objects that give you access to mystic powers, control over aspects of material nature that you can then be seduced into using for your own enjoyment, and then it becomes a source of your own entanglement once again. Similarly, the religious formulations of the Vedas may bring about temporary material happiness, but also can be a source of entanglement as one becomes attached to that material enjoyment. But the ultimate goal of the Vedas is not something that Krishna is putting down, nor is he dissing Vedic culture, the culture within which the ultimate goal of Vedic knowledge or yoga is to be attained. He's simply saying that this aspect of the Vedas from which Arjuna is pulling his arguments of why he should not fight is not really directing anyone toward the ultimate goal of knowledge. Okay. So backtracking just a moment, Mary asks, is Vaikuntha what some would refer to as heaven? Yes and no. Our conception of heaven in Western culture is that we are created at a point in time, we have this one life, and then we go in one direction or the other. If we go to heaven, then henceforth and forevermore, we are in a situation where everything's great and cool and wonderful and nice. In the Vedic conception, heaven is a place in the material world where everything is cool and great and nice, and you can live for such a long time that from our point of view it seems like forever, but it's temporary, part of the material world. Later on in the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna will make this an explicit distinction from the highest planets, the heavenly planets, the world of the celestials, down to the lowest planets, the hellish planets, so to speak. All of them are places of misery on account of the fact that repeated birth and death take place there. It's just a question of how long a life you will live, how much enjoyment you will get, material enjoyment you will get by virtue of the reactions to your actions. But in due course of time, you run the table on your bank account and you're back to zero, and now you've got to do it all over again and generate good karma in order to enjoy your material life. And you could have accrued some bad karma that will cause suffering. So yes and no. I hope that answers your question. Vaikuntha in the Vedic conception is beyond heaven. And heaven is a place where something happens, but it's temporary. Whereas in the Western conception, we're created in a point of time, we leave this body, and if we're good, we go to heaven and stay there henceforth and forevermore. Good. Thank you very much. All right. Now I'm going to come back in a moment to the translation of the Bhagavad-gita by Eknath Easwaran. There are some things that I really like in this translation, and there are also some things that are examples of an interpretive translation. So I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. What I want to do is, well, I'll read this verse first, and then we'll read a set of verses. So this verse 52, the phrase in question, the dense forest of illusion. In other translations, you will see this as the thicket of illusion, or it's almost like, you know, a briar patch of illusion, or a jungle, a dense, thick jungle. But here, the translation will be the confusion of duality. I'll read the verse to you. When your mind has overcome the confusion of duality, you will attain the state of holy indifference to things you hear and things you have heard. Now, I really like the phrase holy indifference, because indifference usually has a negative connotation to it, and detachment is often mistaken for indifference. The phrase I usually use for this is compassionate indifference, which almost sounds like an oxymoron, but I'm going to say that it's a paradox. That we have a healthy detachment from the goings-on of the material world, and yet we still have compassion for all beings living in the material world. Here, he uses this phrase, holy indifference, which I think is a really cool phrase. But before that, he has this other phrase, the confusion of duality as opposed to the forest of illusion, which when I check it against a lot of other translations is kind of unique. Most of the other translations do not add this interpretation. In other words, the idea that the forest of illusion is comprised of confusion born of duality. Now, I introduced a duality into our discussion just a little while ago, the idea of a distinction between a material world and a spiritual world, Vaikuntha. Here, the implication is that duality itself is the illusion. And it is duality that causes confusion. Therefore, to escape from illusion means to escape from duality, which means no you and me, no us and them, no Atma and Param Atma. The implication here is of an undifferentiated oneness. And I'm pointing this out because this is interpretation directly embedded in the translation of an absolute non-dualist point of view. And when I go back and read the rest of the verses, which I hope, I'll still have some time to do, then I think you'll see how there's some back and forth here of things that sound really excellent and wonderful. I've gotten a lot of nice things out of this translation, and also some things that are clearly have this kind of interpretation. So I'll come back to that in just a moment. Here's our verse for this evening that we will chant together. This is our last verse, 53, and I will chant, and you will chant back. So here we go. Shruti vipratipannate yadhastasyati nishchala samadhavachala buddhis tada yogam avapsyasi. The translation for this verse is, when you are no longer perplexed by the flowery language of scriptural invocations and remain fixed in a trance of transcendental awareness, you will have attained the perfect state of union. So Shruti appears here. This is, once again, what is heard. And here is referring to the flowery language of scriptural invocations, that is to say, the Vedas. And this reinforces what I said about the previous verse, what is heard, what has been heard, what is to be heard. So this indicates this is what Krishna is speaking about. Then the third line, samadha vachala buddhis. So samadhav, variation of samadhau or samadhi. So here Krishna is speaking about samadhi that is attainable by action performed while the mind is fixed in perfect knowledge, buddhi. So the ultimate goal of action, namely self-realization, is attained by action in perfect knowledge. If you have any questions about this very interesting proposition, and once again, distinct from the Yoga Sutra's conception of samadhi as a product of meditation that one is doing while presumably not moving, not going anywhere, not doing anything. Samadhi is attainable through action performed in a state of perfect knowledge with one's mind totally focused. When we get to the yoga of meditation a little later in Bhagavad-gita, Krishna will elaborate on this. Here's a cool thing that just happened. we've got 5 definitions of yoga in this section, and here they are. We heard control of the mind and senses, the integration of knowledge and action, the integration of introspection and action, equanimity in action, and the art of liberating action. Cool. We've got 5 different definitions for yoga. All right. And we have a first. This has never happened before. This is our 10th Bhagavad-gita Satsang, and this is the first time that there is only one Jessica in attendance in real time. Jessica, it's so nice to see you. Tonight's program has been brought to you by me, and I hope you're satisfied. We talked about karma yoga, again, still, action without attachment, what it means to be liberated, covering Gita verses 47 through 53. Any questions? Talk to me, talk to me, talk to me. Okay, Nilamadava, text 48 says, perform your duty. How does one know what one's duty is? And is that predetermined? And if so, why act? One's duty is a function of one's nature. That is to say, combination of our natural aptitude and the way we are spontaneously attracted to applying that natural aptitude. The kind of work we want to do, and the skills and talents that we have that we apply to that work. That together defines who we are from the standpoint of our conditional dharma, how the qualities of material nature have shaped us in this particular life. And our duty unto ourselves, unto our family and friends, unto society is defined in that way. That's how we know. It's predetermined insofar as we have karma, and our karma made us this way. But we also have agency. We have free will. How we apply this and respond to our destiny is up to us. So it's predetermined, and we have free will. So free will and destiny are reconciled in the Bhagavad-gita. They're both there in terms of how we are compelled to act, and also how we exercise agency in action. This is, again, a paradox in the Bhagavad-gita. And why act? Because you have to. Because it is impossible not to act. We are forced to act by the qualities of material nature one way or another. We act according to our nature. And that is one reason why Krishna is telling Arjuna that he should not be attached to inaction. So I hope that answers your question there. Thank you very much. Yes, Jess, I know. Good to see you too. All right, further questions, send them to me, send them to me. Hari at Hari-kirtana.com. That's where I hang out, sitting at the edge of my seat, waiting for you to ask me a question. Or give me a comment. Tell me what you think. Whatever realizations you may have had in the course of these first 10 episodes of our webinar in the series. Please share them with me. Okay, next week, here's what we're doing. Symptoms of transcendental knowledge. We're going to talk about pratyahara, turning the senses inward. We're going to talk about controlling the mind and senses, how we acquire a higher taste, verses 54 through 61 is what we're going to do. Thank you once again for spending your time with me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.